Everyone believed the billionaire's only son had been born into silence. For 6 long years, Leo Wakefield lived inside a world with no sound, no laughter, no music, not even the echo of his father's voice. Doctors confirmed what his father feared most. The boy was completely deaf. And so, Richard Wakefield, once a vibrant man with the kind of smile that could fill any room, built a fortress of quiet around his child. But everything changed the day a quiet maid walked through those marble halls. She didn't speak much. She just watched. And what she discovered beneath years of silence would shatter everything they believed about the boy and the darkness that made him this way. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us where you're watching from. The mansion became a shrine to silence. Walls thick enough to bury echoes, halls too wide to carry warmth. Every corner was spotless, lifeless, and still. Richard Wakefield filled the house with technology meant to help. Vibrating alarms, flashing lights, special screens that displayed speech. None of it worked. Leo remained distant, unreachable, staring at nothing for hours like he was trapped somewhere far beyond human touch. When Richard spoke to him, his voice trembled with both love and exhaustion. He would kneel in front of his son and say slowly, "Good morning, Leo. It's me, Dad." But the boy's blue eyes stayed hollow, reflecting only the dim light from the window. He didn't blink, didn't react, didn't see him. Richard wasn't angry, he was just breaking. His wife had died in a helicopter crash when Leo was barely a year old, and now the child she left behind felt like a ghost who never learned to speak. He filled his days with hope and his nights with stories, fairy tales about silent heroes who saved the world without saying a word. But even those stories faded into the same heavy stillness that consumed everything. Each room in that mansion whispered memories of a happier past. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the master bedroom. Her favorite teacup still sat on the kitchen shelf, untouched. Richard walked through those halls at night, just to feel like someone might still be there. Sometimes he spoke aloud, to no one, just to hear a voice echo back. And Leo? He stayed by the same window every day, clutching a torn stuffed animal as if it were a heartbeat he didn't want to lose. He never smiled, never cried. He didn't even flinch when thunder shook the sky. The mansion had become a mausoleum, a place where love survived only as memory. Then, one grey morning, a stranger arrived. Julia Bennett stood at the iron gates with a single suitcase and eyes that carried storms of their own. Her clothes were plain, her voice quiet. But there was something about the way she stood, grounded, calm, unafraid of silence. Richard interviewed her in the study, not expecting much. Most maids came and went within weeks. But Julia didn't fill the air with chatter or pretend optimism. She simply listened, not to sound but to stillness. And that alone made him hire her. Julia wasn't running from poverty. She was running from grief. Months ago she had lost her newborn son after a long, impossible night. Since then the world had felt too loud, too cruel. She needed somewhere quiet enough to breathe again. The Wakefield mansion, cold and empty as it was, felt strangely like home. Her first nights were sleepless. The house creaked like an old heart learning to beat again. But she didn't mind. She cleaned, she organized, she observed. Richard spoke little and Leo never at all. The boy fascinated her, not because of his silence, but because of the way it moved. He never looked up. Yet his body seemed to sense things. A passing shadow, a flicker of light, even her footsteps on the floor. One afternoon, Julia dropped a wooden spoon by accident. It hit the tile softly, barely a sound. But Leo flinched. His shoulders jerked. His head twitched slightly to the side. Her breath caught. If he was completely deaf, how could he have noticed that? The next morning, she tested something small. She walked past his door with deliberate rhythm, letting her heels strike the wooden floor. Thump. Thump. Leo's head turned. Not fully, just a fraction, but enough to make her chest tighten. Julia said nothing. She simply watched. Over the next few days, she performed more silent experiments. A broom handle tapping twice on the floor, a soft hum while dusting near his chair. Each time Leo's body reacted, tiny involuntary movements that no one else would have noticed. The realization came quietly, like dawn breaking through fog. Maybe Leo wasn't completely deaf. Maybe the world still touched him, through vibration, through rhythm, through feeling. Julia didn't tell Richard, not yet. She wasn't ready to give him hope, only to watch it shatter again. Instead, she changed the way she existed around Leo. She no longer rushed through rooms or made sudden noises. She moved like a steady heartbeat, predictable, soft, constant. And Leo, in his own way, began to listen. When she entered a room, his shoulders would relax. When she placed a blanket beside him, he didn't turn away. Sometimes his eyes followed her reflection in the window, not directly, but enough to show that he noticed. She began leaving small things near him. A picture book, a cup of water, a folded napkin with a faint lavender scent. She never said it was for him. She never asked for thanks. But the next day, those items would be moved slightly, touched by small, curious hands. The silence between them started to change shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was aware. Julia didn't understand why she cared so deeply for a boy she barely knew. Maybe it was because she saw her own lost child in his quiet eyes. Maybe it was because, for the first time since her loss, she felt a purpose again. And though Richard didn't see it yet, something in the mansion was shifting. The air didn't feel so heavy. The silence didn't feel so final. For the first time in years, the stillness inside the Wakefield mansion felt less like death, and more like a secret waiting to be heard. The following week unfolded quietly, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. Julia went about her duties, dusting shelves, folding linen, polishing glass, but her eyes were always drawn toward one small figure sitting by the window. Leo. He rarely moved. Sometimes he would trace invisible shapes on the glass, as though he were sketching memories only he could see. Other times he simply stared into the distance, the stuffed animal pressed tight against his chest. But Julia's eyes were sharper than anyone's who had ever worked here. She noticed patterns no one else had. When she dragged a chair slightly across the wooden floor, his head tilted. When she set a pot on the counter, his eyes flickered. Tiny, delicate responses, the kind only someone listening without sound could make. One morning, Julia decided to test it. She walked slowly down the long corridor leading to Leo's room. Each step was measured, soft at first, then firm. She let her heels hit the ground harder, creating faint vibrations that rippled through the wooden floor. Leo was sitting cross-legged by the wall, clutching his toy. When Julia's footsteps grew firmer, his head turned slightly toward her direction. It wasn't random. It was instinctive. Julia froze. Her pulse quickened. He can feel it. The realization hit her like a whisper through the dark. Fragile but undeniable. Leo's silence wasn't absence. It was translation. He was perceiving the world differently, in a rhythm no one had bothered to learn. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She replayed every small moment, every flinch, every blink, every subtle motion. She wasn't imagining it. Something was happening beneath the surface. The next day she began a new pattern of gentle experiments, always quiet, always respectful. In the kitchen, while Leo sat at the table doodling aimlessly on paper, Julia lifted the end of a broomstick and tapped it lightly against the floor. Once, twice. The sound was dull, but the vibrations traveled. Leo blinked. His hand paused mid-doodle. His eyes darted sideways just for a moment. Julia said nothing. She simply continued sweeping. Later, while organizing the bookshelf, she tapped on the wood twice, soft but rhythmic. Leo turned his head again. It was undeniable now. His reactions weren't coincidence. They were responses. But Julia still needed to be certain. She needed something stronger than vibrations alone. One afternoon, while cleaning the guest room closets, She found something odd buried beneath an old pile of cloth, a single wireless earbud, dusty but intact. She held it for a moment, turning it over in her hand, thinking. A quiet, risky idea began to form. That evening, as rain pattered gently against the mansion windows, Julia connected the earbud to her phone. She searched for a soft instrumental track, slow piano, barely above a whisper. She approached Leo carefully, every movement deliberate. He was sitting on the floor again, back against the wall, lost in his own still world. Julia crouched beside him and gently placed the earbud near his right ear. She didn't insert it. She just let the faint sound hover close. The music played softly, filling the air with fragile notes. At first, nothing happened. Then Leo's body shifted. His eyes widened slightly. His breathing changed, slower, deeper, uncertain. He tilted his head as if trying to follow something invisible. Julia froze. She didn't dare breathe. For 6 years the world had been told this child was deaf, and yet right now he was searching for sound. She pulled the earbud back gently, heart pounding. Leo's expression stayed puzzled, like someone tasting a forgotten flavor. She didn't tell Richard that night. Not yet. Not without proof. The next day she tried again. This time with nature sounds, the chirp of birds, the soft murmur of wind through trees. She brought the earbud close to Leo's left ear. He blinked twice and turned his face slightly toward it. His lips parted faintly, as though trying to speak, or remember how. Julia felt her throat tighten. Every test confirmed what she already knew. Leo wasn't entirely deaf. He wasn't broken. He had simply been misunderstood, but Julia couldn't rest there. She needed to understand why. If all the doctors had said he was deaf, what had gone wrong? Days passed, each one filled with quiet discoveries. Leo began to show subtle emotions, curiosity, calm, even faint amusement. Sometimes when Julia placed her hand on the table, he mirrored her movement, pressing his small palm against the wood to feel its vibration. He was connecting, wordlessly but deeply. For the first time, Julia saw something alive flicker in his eyes. Not noise, not confusion, awareness. But beneath that progress, a question gnawed at her. If Leo could sense sound, why had everyone believed otherwise? There had to be a reason. Something buried in the past. That answer came by accident. One afternoon, while cleaning the old medical storage room at the back of the mansion, Julia found a small cabinet with a broken handle. Inside were dusty bottles, old files, and faded medication boxes, some still labeled with Leo's name. She knelt on the floor, wiping the dust with trembling hands. The words on one bottle caught her eye. Long, complicated medical terms she didn't recognize. But something about them felt wrong. She took pictures quietly, then put everything back exactly as it was. That night, alone in her room, Julia searched those names online, her screen filled with results, neurological drugs, discontinued compounds, and warnings. One in particular stopped her cold. May cause permanent auditory nerve damage in children under 5. Her breath hitched. She checked again. Multiple sources confirmed it. The same drug, the same side effect. Julia stared at the photo on her screen, her hand shaking. The medicine that was supposed to help Leo might have been the very thing that took his hearing away. She sat back, staring into the dark. It wasn't just tragedy anymore. It was betrayal. Julia didn't sleep that night. She kept replaying the image of Leo sitting on the floor, reacting to the faintest hum, the softest sound, fighting through the damage the world had done to him. By morning, her grief had turned into quiet determination. She couldn't undo the past, but she could uncover the truth. The boy everyone had given up on wasn't broken. He had been hurt, and now, finally, someone was listening. The next morning, Julia stood by the window as the pale sunlight spilled into the mansion's cold halls. Her eyes were tired from sleepless nights, but her resolve was unshaken. She could no longer pretend not to see the truth. Leo wasn't lost in silence. He was trapped beneath it. Every day since the discovery, Julia had tested him carefully, never pushing, never scaring him. And each time, the same miracle repeated itself in small, quiet ways. A blink, a turn of the head, a soft breath that seemed to fall in rhythm with the music. It was time to take one more step. That afternoon she entered Leo's room. The air felt heavy with sunlight and dust. Leo was sitting on the carpet as usual, hugging his worn-out stuffed animal. He didn't look up when Julia walked in, but he didn't freeze either. That was new. She knelt beside him, her voice low and soft. "Leo," she said, "I'm going to play a sound again, okay?" He didn't respond, but his hands tightened around the toy. Julia took out the same wireless earbud, connected it to her phone, and found a gentle piano melody, the kind that floated like a heartbeat through the air. She brought it close to his ear. The first notes drifted out. At first, Leo stayed still, his gaze empty. Then, slowly, his eyebrows drew together. His breathing shifted. His lips parted slightly. His small shoulders trembled as though something invisible had touched him for the first time in years. Julia's heart pounded. She whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe." Leo blinked again, his eyes darting upward as if searching for the sound. And then something extraordinary happened. His lips moved. At first no voice came. Then, barely audible, like air breaking through silence, he whispered, "I think heard Mommy." Julia froze. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The words were fragile, almost uncertain, but they were real. After 6 years of silence, the boy had spoken, and the first word he remembered was Mommy. Tears filled her eyes. She didn't cry out or rush to him. She simply placed a trembling hand over her mouth, afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Leo looked dazed, almost frightened by the sound of his own voice. He hugged his stuffed toy tighter and looked down again. Julia didn't push. She only whispered, "That's beautiful, Leo." Her voice quivered, but she stayed composed. She knew this was no small miracle. It was proof that something inside Leo had survived all those years of silence. She sat with him for a long time, the two of them sharing a wordless stillness filled with emotion. Julia wanted to tell Richard right away, but she stopped herself. Not yet. She needed to be sure it wasn't a fleeting accident. She needed to see it again. The next day she prepared once more. The sun had just begun to set, painting the mansion gold. She entered Leo's room with calm certainty. "Ready?" she whispered. Leo didn't move, but his eyes followed her. That was all the answer she needed. She played another soft melody, this time with faint strings, something slow, almost dreamlike. Leo tilted his head toward the sound again. His lips parted. For a moment, Julia thought he might speak, but before he could, the door burst open. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression twisted from confusion to fury in seconds. "What are you doing?" he snapped, striding into the room. Julia jumped, startled. "Wait, please, it's not what you think." "Are you putting sound in his ear?" Richard shouted. His voice thundered through the silence, shattering everything. "He's deaf, Julia. You can't do that. You'll confuse him." Leo flinched. The music stopped. The boy backed away, his hands gripping the toy as fear flashed in his eyes. "Mr. Wakefield, please," Julia said quickly. "He can hear something. He's reacting, I swear. Just let me show you." But Richard cut her off, his anger sharp, his grief surfacing. "You think I haven't tried everything? You think I didn't spend years begging doctors for hope? Don't play with me, Julia." He reached to grab the phone from her hand. But before he could, Leo ran. The boy dropped his stuffed animal and rushed straight toward Julia. He threw his arms around her waist and clung to her tightly. Trembling, Julia froze, her breath catching as the tiny hands gripped her shirt like they were holding on to life itself. Richard stopped dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, From somewhere deep inside that silence, a small voice broke through. I heard a sound. Both adults went still. Leo's voice was faint but clear, trembling but certain. His eyes lifted toward his father, wide and bright with something new, awareness. Richard's face crumpled. His body swayed as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "Say that again," he whispered. Leo swallowed. I heard. The words came slowly, but they came. Richard's knees gave out, and he sat heavily on the edge of the bed. For years he had lived for this impossible moment, and now that it was here he couldn't speak. His eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to hide. Julia held Leo close, one hand on his back, her own tears slipping silently down her face. The room that had always known only stillness now held something new, life. Richard finally looked at Julia, voice shaking. How long has this been happening?" Julia explained everything. The vibrations, the earbud, the small reactions she'd observed, and finally the medication. When she mentioned the medicine, Richard's expression changed completely. He stood up abruptly, his jaw tight. "Those were prescribed by Dr. Morrow," he said. "He said they'd help stabilize Leo's nerves." "I thought—" Julia nodded gently. "I know, but they're dangerous. They can damage hearing, especially in children." Richard stared at her for a long time, then at Leo, who was still clinging to her shirt. His voice broke. "Stop them! Today! No more medicine!" Julia nodded. That night, the mansion felt different. The air was softer. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was resting, healing. In the days that followed, Julia continued her quiet sessions with Leo. Music, nature sounds, soft tones. Every time Leo responded, more confident now, less afraid. He smiled when the piano played, turned when someone whispered his name. Richard began to watch from the doorway, silent, astonished. The guilt on his face was heavy, but the hope was heavier. For the first time in years, father and son were connected, not through machines, not through desperation, but through a single, fragile miracle. The silence was no longer their prison. It had become their beginning. The next few days blurred into a strange, quiet joy. Leo's reactions grew stronger. His movements were livelier, his eyes brighter. The child who had once lived behind an invisible wall was now turning toward voices, blinking at sounds, even smiling when Julia played soft melodies near him. Richard watched everything in disbelief. He stayed silent, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might undo the miracle. But Julia's calm never faltered. Every step she took, every sound she made was deliberate, gentle enough to keep Leo safe, patient enough to keep him curious. It didn't take long for Richard's hope to mix with something darker, guilt. He couldn't stop thinking about those bottles in the cabinet, the drugs he had given his son for years without question. One evening, after putting Leo to bed, Julia returned to that same medical cabinet. Her hands shook as she pulled out one of the bottles. The label was faded but legible. Dr. Atticus Morrow, Pediatric Neurology. She took the bottle to her room, wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in her bag. The next day, during her break, she went to meet an old friend, Dr. Helena Costa, a physician she once studied with in nursing school before life pulled her away from her career. They sat across from each other in a small clinic office. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Julia placed the bottle on the table. "Helena," she whispered, "can you tell me if this could damage a child's hearing?" Helena read the label, her brow furrowing. "This isn't something you give to children," she said, "especially not long-term." Her voice grew tense as she turned the bottle in her hand. "Where did you get this?" Julia hesitated. "It was prescribed to a boy I work for. He's been on it for years. He's deaf, or at least everyone believes he is." Helena's expression hardened. "Let me look into this." By the next evening, Helena called Julia back. "Julia," she said quietly, "you were right to be worried. This drug contains compounds that affect the auditory nerves. It's been linked to multiple cases of hearing loss in young children. Julia's chest tightened. So it could have caused— Yes, Helena interrupted gently. It could have caused everything. And there's more. The doctor who prescribed it, Atticus Morrow, lost his license 5 years ago. He was accused of using unapproved medications in private trials, some involving children. Julia's blood ran cold. So Leo wasn't sick, she whispered. He was used, Helena nodded grimly. He was part of something that never should have happened. Julia thanked her, voice trembling, and left the clinic. On the way back to the mansion, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The city lights blurred through her tears. That night, after tucking Leo into bed, she found Richard in the living room, sitting in silence beside the fireplace. The flames flickered weakly, painting exhaustion across his face. "Mr. Wakefield," she said softly, "we need to talk." Richard looked up. There was something hollow in his eyes, as if he already knew what was coming. Julia placed the medicine bottle on the table and slowly slid a printed document toward him, the report from Helena. "I found this in your cabinet," she began, "and I spoke to a doctor. This medication, it wasn't safe. It was part of an experimental study. The man who prescribed it wasn't licensed to treat children anymore." Richard's hand froze over the papers. He began to read, eyes scanning line after line, his face turning pale. When he reached the section about revoked licenses and unethical trials, his jaw trembled. He dropped the paper and whispered, "I trusted him." Julia said nothing. She just sat beside him and waited. "I let that man give my son those pills," Richard said, his voice breaking. "He told me it would help Leo's brain develop, that it might trigger speech responses. I believed him. God, I believed him." He covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook. Julia reached out carefully and placed her hand on his arm. "You didn't know," she said softly. "You were grieving. You were desperate to save your son. That's not guilt, it's love. But now we know the truth, and we can't ignore it." Richard lifted his head slowly. His eyes glistened with tears. "He did this to my boy," he whispered. "He took his hearing. He stole his childhood," Julia nodded. "Then we take it back." They sat together for a long time in silence, not the heavy kind that had once haunted the mansion, but a new kind, filled with purpose. That night, they made a list. Contact a new specialist for an independent evaluation. Gather every medical record related to Dr. Morrow. File an official report with the health authority. Richard no longer looked defeated. For the first time in years, he looked ready to fight. "Leo deserves the truth," Julia said firmly. Richard met her eyes. "And justice," he added. The next morning they began. Julia organized old receipts, test results and prescriptions while Richard made phone calls. The more they uncovered, the darker it became. Missing documents, mismatched dates, vague medical notes. Everything pointed to deliberate negligence. Meanwhile, Leo was thriving. Without the medication, his energy returned. He laughed softly when Julia tapped the table to match the rhythm of a song. He responded when Richard whispered his name from across the room. Sometimes he would point at objects and try forming words, fragile but beautiful attempts. Light, bird, mom. Each one felt like a sunrise after years of night. By the end of the week, the first meeting with a new doctor was arranged. Unlike Morrow, this one listened. He ran simple tests, non-invasive, gentle. After the results, he looked at Richard and Julia and said, "He's not fully deaf. His hearing is partial. Impaired, yes, but active. With therapy and time, he'll improve." Richard's eyes filled again. Julia smiled through quiet tears. Everything they had believed for 6 years had been built on lies. But the truth, though painful, was finally setting them free. That night, Richard poured 2 cups of tea and sat with Julia at the kitchen table. Leo was asleep upstairs. The mansion, once haunted by silence, now hummed with faint echoes of laughter and piano melodies from earlier in the day. "We've come a long way," Julia said softly. Richard nodded. "But we're not done yet," she smiled faintly. "No, now we fight." And under the flickering kitchen light, surrounded by papers and quiet determination, they made a silent promise. No one would ever silence Leo Wakefield again. The days that followed were unlike any the mansion had seen before. The walls that once held nothing but silence now carried the soft sounds of change, footsteps, laughter, the faint hum of a child's voice learning to exist again. But beneath that fragile peace, a storm was building. Richard and Julia had filed the official complaint. They had gathered evidence, medical files, records, videos of Leo reacting to sound, and reports from the new doctor. And now the investigation had begun. At first it moved quietly, but soon people started calling, reporters, investigators, even families who had once been under Dr. Atticus Morrow's care. The same pattern repeated, children treated with the same drug, all showing similar symptoms. The truth was no longer theirs alone. Still, the fight was ugly. Richard received threatening calls telling him to stop. Julia got anonymous messages warning her not to testify. But neither of them backed down. They had already lost too much to fear silence again. When the court date finally arrived, the air outside the courthouse felt heavy, like the weight of 6 years of injustice pressing down on them. Julia stood tall beside Richard, dressed simply but confidently. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters filled the benches, cameras waiting for headlines. When Julia was called to the stand, she spoke without hesitation. She told the story exactly as it happened, from the day she arrived at the mansion to the moment Leo spoke his first word. Her voice never cracked, but her eyes glistened when she said, "He wasn't born broken. He was made to believe he was." Then Richard took the stand. He didn't hide his guilt. He didn't try to justify it. "I trusted a man who preyed on my grief," he said quietly. "And because of that my son suffered. I will spend the rest of my life making it right." The defense tried to discredit them, calling it emotional exaggeration. But then came the videos, Leo sitting in his chair, responding to music. Leo smiling as Julia played a melody. Leo whispering the word, "Mom." The courtroom went silent, and then came the final blow. Multiple families testified to the same story. Children prescribed experimental drugs under Morrow's care. Some had lost their hearing permanently. Others were still recovering. When the verdict was read, Julia closed her eyes and exhaled. Dr. Atticus Morrow, guilty on all counts. Unethical experimentation, endangerment of minors, revoked license, permanent justice at last. When they left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing. But Julia kept walking, holding Richard's hand in quiet solidarity. They didn't need to speak. They had won, not for revenge, but for Leo's truth. Weeks passed. The mansion no longer felt cold. It was alive again. Leo's laughter echoed down the hallways. Music played softly from the living room. His small keyboard, his new favorite toy. Julia and Richard often stood in the doorway just watching him, their silence now filled with pride instead of pain. Therapy had become part of his life. His speech improved slowly, each word shaping itself like a small miracle. Dad, Julia, music. Every syllable was a victory. Richard started working again but never stayed away long. He wanted to be home for Leo's lessons, for his discoveries, for his laughter. Julia, once just a housekeeper, was no longer an employee. She was family. She began the process of adopting Leo, and Richard supported her completely. The paperwork took weeks, but the day it was approved, Julia cried quietly in the kitchen. When she told Leo, he tilted his head, smiled shyly, and said, "Mom." This time the word came clearly. She knelt and hugged him tight, tears soaking his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm your mom now." Richard stood nearby, eyes glistening. He didn't interrupt. He just placed a hand on both of their shoulders and whispered, "We're home." From that day, everything changed. The mansion's walls, once grey and lifeless, now carried colour, soft gold, warm beige. Drawings by Leo taped on doors and windows. He drew the three of them often, himself in the middle, Julia on one side, Richard on the other. Above them, he always scribbled a small sun and musical notes floating around it. Music had become Leo's new language. Every afternoon, he sat at the small piano Richard bought him and played short melodies. Some were bright and fast, others gentle and slow, but all carried the same feeling, hope. By the time Leo turned 10, he had written several small pieces of music. Julia kept every sheet in a folder labelled Leo's Voice. One morning they received a letter from his school. A local foundation was organizing an event called Stories of Strength to honor children who had overcome extraordinary odds. Leo had been nominated by his teacher and chosen. When Julia told him, Leo grinned. "Can I play a song?" She smiled through tears. "You can play anything you want." The night of the event arrived. The auditorium was filled with parents, teachers, and families. Leo wore a neat shirt, his hair combed carefully, and a tiny pin in the shape of a musical note glimmered on his chest. When his name was called, he walked to the stage with quiet confidence. Julia and Richard watched from the front row, hands clasped tightly. The host placed the medal around Leo's neck and handed him the microphone. "Would you like to say something, Leo?" He nodded, his small hands gripping the mic. He looked at the crowd, then at Julia. "The first sound I ever heard," he said slowly, "came from her heart." The audience fell silent. Julia's breath caught. Tears welled instantly. "She believed in me," Leo continued softly. "She listened when no one else did. That's when I started to hear. For a long moment, no one moved. Then quiet sobs filled the hall, followed by a wave of applause that seemed to shake the air. Julia covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Richard reached for her hand, his eyes wet but smiling. Leo stepped down from the stage and ran straight into Julia's arms. She hugged him tightly, whispering through tears, "You're my miracle." Richard placed a hand on both of them and said, voice trembling, "Ours." That night, back at the mansion, Leo placed his medal beside his keyboard. He sat down, pressed a few keys, and played a soft tune, the same one Julia had once used to reach him years ago. Julia stood in the doorway, smiling. Richard joined her, his arm brushing hers. "He's come so far," Richard whispered. Julia nodded. "And he's not done yet." The music played softly, filling every corner of the once silent house. The same house that had once mourned was now alive, with laughter, with sound, with love. Leo looked up at them, smiling, and said quietly, "Do you hear it?" Julia smiled back, eyes glistening. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "We hear everything now." Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm truly grateful that you stayed with me till the very last moment. It means a lot. Stories like this remind us how powerful love, truth, and second chances can be. I'd love to know what you felt while watching. Which part touched you the most, or maybe even broke your heart a little? Share your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Until next time.